Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder position needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. Today's video is going to be about reviewing Pathfinder Lost Omens Draconic Codex. This book comes out on December 3rd, which is probably a couple days from the release date of this video, and boy am I excited for this book. I think it is my favorite in the Lost Omen lines of books, overtaking Battlecry, which I loved a lot and talked a lot about on this channel. So let's not delay. Let's start talking about why I love this book and all of the cool options that this book makes available, mostly for GMs, but also quite a few for players. Before I start showing off some of the coolest details, let's do the highlights at a broad level of what's in this book. Of course, to no one's surprise, there are stat blocks for dragons for the GM to use. But what is surprising is the sheer quantity of dragons this book has. I counted, and there are 17 dragons that are entirely new to the remaster. Now, a small portion of these are reprints of what used to exist before. For example, the Stormcrown Dragon is a reprint of the Blue Dragon from the OGL days. Likewise, many of the Tiansha dragons, the Imperial dragons as they're called, also got reprinted in this book. But the majority of the new dragons, more than half for sure, are still brand new, not seen before in any other content as far as I know. Each of these, of course, comes with a young, adult, and ancient version, which means these 17 new dragons permute into something like 50-ish stat blocks, which is awesome. It's a lot of new content to play with. There are also a couple draconic options that are not true dragons, but the majority of this book is about true dragons. And of course, there are reprints, but the reprints of the legacy dragons generally tend to be more interesting than they used to be too. I will get into a specific example of how and why later on in this video, but take my word for it for now that they are more interesting than they used to be. And finally, there are printings of ARCHDRAGONs. Now, ARCHDRAGONs are something that I have been missing in Pathfinder for a while. ARCHDRAGONs are the equivalent of what D&D calls GREATWYRMS. These are dragons that are so powerful that they're practically the same level as a low-level demigod, or the avatar of a god that manifests on Golarion. In level terms, that's going to be between levels 21 and 25. ARCHDRAGONs are supposed to be older and more dangerous and more intelligent than ancient dragons even, and Pathfinder generally just lacked the rules for these. We had one template in Menkare, a named golden greatworm from the legacy days, but now there is an ARCHDRAGON for every single dragon type in Pathfinder. This includes every dragon type that already existed in the remaster, including the ones that came in Monster Core 2, such as the Cinder Dragon, and it also includes every single one of the dragons that are new to the remaster and the ones that are entirely new. So while I didn't count the exact number, that's like 40 total something ARCHDRAGONs. And just like how there's a progression of abilities and permission between young, adult, and ancient dragons, ARCHDRAGONs take it to the next tier and add even more interesting abilities to many of the dragon stat blocks. Again, I will be showing off one of these later on. And what this book gives goes beyond just the stat blocks as well. There is a ton of lore. There's the reintroduction of named dragons from Legacy that had sort of entered this limbo because of the transition from OGL to Orc. There are sketches on what these dragons look like. There are lore snippets of how they behave, what sort of lairs they're in, what sort of adventures they might be adversaries or allies in. This level of detailed signposting will make dragons really easy to just pick up and insert into your games because of the sheer amount of effort and thought that's been put into them. As you look through the stat blocks, you will also see that some dragons are more geared towards being commanders, whereas others are more geared towards being solo, dynamic boss battles on their own. Some of them fit better into some environments and others fit better into other environments, and a lot of this gets talked about in the lore that's provided for GMs. And of course, it's not just all GM options. There's a surprising number of player options in this book. First, there are dozens of new options for the Draconic Sorcerer and the Dragonblood Heritage to pick from. Again, didn't count the exact number. I think there are 40-something specific options for the Draconic Sorcerer. And that is a crazy list. That's 40 different options that each come with their own damage type and spell lists for the Draconic Gift section of what your bloodline gives you. Likewise, for the Dragonblood heritage, you have different options for your breath weapon damage type as well as your damage resistance type. And the heritage also benefited from a handful of new ancestry feats. There's also now an option to simply play as a dragon. A really small one, mind you, but you're still a dragon, a dragonette. There's a whole host of new spells and spell catalysts which go into the draconic themes, and I will be talking about these later in the video in more detail. And finally, the one I am most excited for, the Drake Rider archetype. Now, drakes have been an animal companion option in Pathfinder for a long time, but you're not allowed to fly while you're mounting them. This archetype finally introduces a way for you to have a flying drake companion, which is obviously a crucial part of the fantasy, and I am really glad that Paizo has delivered on that. Now let's get into some more specifics. So the first dragon I wanted to talk about is the Rime Dragon. This is a reprint of what used to be called the White Dragon, and I wanted to highlight here how Paizo took a lot of creative liberty in how they're moving away from the old designs and really thinking about what kind of a dragon this would be to fight in fiction. So, for example, the Rime Dragon is defined by living in cold environments and thus being very freezing cold. So one of the abilities it has is Rime Shield. If it flies, it catches water vapor on its scales, freezes them, and then it converts that into defensive ice. So it gets a bonus to AC and some temp HP. The temp HP scales for older dragons. This is the number for young Rime Dragons. Now from that, it gets a follow-up. It has Piercing Ice. It can detach these scales, losing the bonus to AC and temp HP, and then instead damage everyone around them in an emanation. This ability sort of introduces this back and forth of defensive versus offensive, a pretty meaningful tactical choice for GMs to use if they're using this dragon as a set-piece boss encounter, like a level +3 boss, for instance. And like I said earlier, as the dragons get older, they keep that pattern of getting newer and more interesting abilities. So when the dragon turns into an adult, it gets this ability, where everyone around them, due to the freezing cold, gets slowed down a little bit on a success, a lot on a failure, or completely immobilized on a critical failure. Between all of these abilities, you can kind of feel that the game is signposting that you should run this dragon as a significant chunk of the complexity of an encounter. It has a lot of interplay between defense and offense. It has a lot of passive abilities. If you read a lot of its other passives, you will also see signposting for what kind of an arena you would fight this dragon in. So I think it's a pretty good showcase of what Paizo is doing with the dragons that are just reprints. It's not just lazily reprinting what we already had, it's adding to them in cool and meaningful ways. Now, speaking of new and improved dragons, let's talk about what used to be my favorite legacy dragon and my favorite dragon in D&D, the Blue Dragon, and what it's become in the remaster, the Stormcrown Dragon. And it's a hell of an improvement. So first, the Stormcrown name is already fantastic because the Blue Dragon was all about storms. They're the lightning-themed dragon. Their color is blue, their breath is a lightning bolt, and if you go to its stat block on D&D Beyond, you will see that it lists thunderstorms surrounding its lair as being an effect of the Blue Dragon. And before we talk about any of the mechanics, first, look at that art. It looks so gorgeous. I love the little tines on top of its head that look like a crown. I love that they have thematically reflected how lightning in Pathfinder is associated both with air and with metal. So there's metallic tines in its crown, but of course it has a lot of air magic, which you will see in its stat block once it starts showcasing bits of that. And even the description for what happens around its lair is so good. Given time, a Stormcrown Dragon's territory becomes a windswept, storm-racked brushland. Stone erodes into jagged formations. Earth becomes webbed and traced with fulgurites. And sand vitrifies into eerie formations of glass, eventually shattering into crystal dust that storm winds lift in flaying gusts. So the idea is that if you're approaching an old Stormcrown Dragon's lair, the sand around that lair would eventually have turned into broken glass, and that is so evocative and so cool. Imagine a thunderstorm raging in the background as you walk through a desert and just start noticing that there's little mountains and dunes made of glass, not sand or rock, as you approach the dragon's lair. This lore snippet, by the way, is not unique to the Stormcrown Dragon. I just showcased it because I loved it so much, but every dragon printed in this book, including ones that are not new to this book, they were just reprinted for the purposes of showcasing their ARCHDRAGON, every single dragon gets a one-page snippet like this, with a beautiful piece of art and lots of lore on what this dragon behaves like and what happens to the area surrounding them as they get older. But that's all flavor text, right? Let's get into the mechanics of why I think the Stormcrown Dragon is so much cooler than the old blue dragon. So the mechanics of the Stormcrown Dragon, just like with the Rhyme Dragon, are a departure from their legacy counterpart. But I also think the Stormcrown Dragon makes a really cool showcase of how evocative and thematic and cool options get to be in Pathfinder when we distance ourselves from sacred cows from the D&D era of design. So let's talk about a really basic option. They have a ranged strike called Stormbolt, which is simply a bolt of lightning they fire at a 60-foot range increment. Nothing too special about that. It's a lightning dragon, you would expect a ranged lightning attack. Now where this gets cool is that they have a reaction that when they're targeted by an attack or spell, they can fire that bolt of lightning, arcing along the displacement of the air by that physical attack or by the displacement of magic by that spell, and they can shoot that Stormbolt right back at the person that attacked them. This is a really cool way of using a really simple one-action baseline mechanic of the dragon and using it to really tell a story about what's happening in fiction, really get to the imagination of the GM and the players. And these are the sorts of abilities that make set-piece boss fights with a stat block like this at the center so much cooler than they otherwise could be. Remember that a boss is not just about having better numbers than the players. It gets a lot more interesting when there's a cool back and forth going on. That Rhyme Shield followed by the Rhyme attack from the previous dragon was also an example of this, and so is this. But it only gets cooler from there. So next up, their breath weapon isn't a cone or a line. Every chromatic and metallic dragon in D&D has a breath weapon that's either a cone or a line. And I believe that's the case in Pathfinder's legacy chromatic and metallic dragons too. But realistically, why does that need to be the case for a lightning dragon? Why can't your breath weapon just be a chain lightning? And that's exactly what we get over here. Their breath weapon is a downcast version of chain lightning. And again, a simple change like this helps the stat block tell an entirely different story than a lot of other dragon stat blocks will. And finally, they get a set of abilities that are all boosted when they're in stormy weather. So for example, if they use an action to just stay in place in stormy weather, they become concealed because the lightning starts arcing off of their scales and tines and they're no longer visible. Likewise, they just don't fall if they don't fly during their turn because they're lofted by air magic. And they're similarly not affected by strong winds if they don't want to be. And finally, when they're inside a storm, anytime they use Draconic Frenzy or cast an electricity spell, they can also additionally arc a bit of lightning from the sky onto one of their targets. Again, very simple abilities from a mechanical perspective, but when you take the whole picture, when you combine all of them, this page containing the Storm Dragon stat blocks is practically screaming at the GM to use this dragon as a really epic and thematic set-piece encounter, which all by itself will feel like several moving parts because of the storm surrounding the dragon's lair. And the book is filled with these awesome set-piece dragons. The Stormcrown Dragon is not unique in the sorts of interactions it has. The unique thing is that all of these dragons will tell a different story depending on where and how you use them. Now, before we move on to the player-facing options, I wanted to show off both a brand new dragon, one that is not a reprint of anything that is in Legacy or Remaster, and what an Archdragon looks like in this game. So I'm going to be talking about these abilities of the Time Dragon from Young all the way to Archdragon, and just keep in mind that any of the older abilities get scaled up in numbers whenever you refer to a dragon that's older than them. So first, we'll talk about the Young Time Dragon's Time Shift Breath ability. This is a cone, but unlike most Draconic cones, it's not about dealing damage. because it's about shifting enemies through time, it will either slow them, 1 or 2, depending on success or failure, or on a critical failure, completely phase them out of existence for a whole round. During that phased out time, they cannot be impacted by anything, be it friend or foe. Now, when this dragon becomes an adult, it gains the Temporal Eddies ability. This can only be used once in an encounter, but the dragon moves and leaves an afterimage in each space it moved through. From the observer's perspective, the dragon is in all of these spaces. So anytime that players try to target this dragon with anything, they need to make a DC 15 flat check just to have narrowed down the right dragon between all of these afterimages. But on the flip side, the dragon can actually act from any of these spaces, kind of like a mirror thaumaturge on steroids. This ability is crazy, both in terms of how cool it is in fiction, and also mechanically just kind of crazy. I don't think I've seen an equivalent of this on any monster before. This ability, on the surface, seems crazy busted, but when you look at the action cost, it sort of eases off. Because it has a 2 action cost up front, that turn, the dragon is not going to do something that is disastrous to the party. It can't use its breath weapon. It can't use Draconic Frenzy. And now the next follow-up turn is going to be brutal. It's going to have 3 actions, any of which can originate from any of the spaces it moved through on its last turn. And dragons have crazy fly speed, so this can be a huge number of spaces. The party is effectively trapped. There is no backline, frontline. There's really no way to protect yourself from the dragon for that turn. But this is a telegraph move. Because nothing huge happened on turn 1, you now have a whole round of the party's actions to react to what this dragon can do. Telegraph moves are something that I think make for really cool boss fights. When the boss does something that the party will now get a round to react to before it actually punishes them. So the party can now shore up on defensive options. Maybe the spellcaster puts themselves in a containment temporarily to make sure they're safe during whatever the hell the dragon's going to do on its following turn. So this is one of those abilities that's designed to look cinematic and appear really busted and frightening, but mechanically, it's still a good ability from a boss fight, which is kind of what you want out of boss fights. Cool abilities that feel like they're breaking the game, but not actually breaking the game. Then consider the Ancient Dragon's Second Chance ability, which it can use once per round. Again, like I mentioned, signposting for the Stormcrown Dragon, which told GMs to use them as a boss, this ability tells you to use the Time Dragon not as a boss, but as a commander with a few minions, because it can use this ability to reroll saving throws for those minions. If the spellcaster throws out this big AoE and one of the minions crit fails and is going to be incapacitated for a few rounds, make them reroll, see if they don't crit fail this time. So again, another piece of cool signposting on how this dragon can be used in an actual encounter, in an actual campaign or one-shot. And finally, we get to the ARCHDRAGON. And of course, the ARCHDRAGON is supposed to be something level 21 plus. The ARCHDRAGON is supposed to get the broken abilities, the stuff that makes you feel like, yeah, I'm fighting something that's almost like the avatar of a god. And it gets that. When you try to fight this dragon, you make a fortitude save, and on a failure, you're randomly aged to either be elderly, in which case you become enfeebled, or too young, in which case you're clumsy, and on a critical failure, the penalties are magnified. This ability lasts for 1 round, and then unless you succeed on the following round, you will again be aged up or down. This makes the ARCHDRAGON feel like a real temporal reality warper, and again, makes for really cool demigod-like fights that you would expect when your characters are in the level 18 plus range. So that's all the showcasing of the dragons I wanted to do. I showed you 3 dragons, but this book has so many, so make sure to check it out. Even if you don't buy the book, there's so much coming out once this gets on Methis. Now let's talk about some juicy new player options. This book doesn't have a ton of new spells and spell catalysts, but the ones it does have, a couple of them stood out to me. So I'm going to be talking about 2 new spells and 1 new spell catalyst. First up, Horde of Underlings. This is a 3-action rank 3 spell on all traditions. It creates a 30-foot cone, and it's sustained up to 1 minute. Now, this has the rare tag, so GMs can disallow it if they just don't want it at their tables, but in my opinion, you should allow it. It's not like overly powerful or anything, and I don't think it's going to introduce too much of a tracking burden. The reason this spell stands out to me is because this does something that players have asked for a pretty long time, and unfortunately, it doesn't fit well into the way Pathfinder does its player-side action economy. That being having a horde of minions. And I know the Necromancer comes out next year, but it is nice to not feel locked into the one class if you want to do a little bit of minion-mancy, especially if you're not interested in doing undead. This spell makes it clear that the underlings you summon don't have to be undead. They can be skeletons, but they can also just be normal kobolds. You're deciding what they are. So if you're trying to play a shepherd druid of some kind, this can be a whole bunch of squirrels or hawks or whatever you would like. And what the spell does is summon D&D 4th edition or Drawsteel style minions. They have 1 HP, they don't block spaces, but they do offer difficult terrain in the spaces they occupy. They're automatically hit by anything the enemy does, and they're automatically gonna fail all saving throws. When they make attacks, you don't roll an attack roll. They automatically deal 1d4 damage. This spell by default summons 6 minions, and then as you heighten it, it adds 2, 2, 2, and so on and so forth. And each time you sustain the spell, they will repeat the damage they did to adjacent enemies and also get to move before that if needed. This is a good compromise, in my opinion, for people who want to summon large numbers of creatures onto the battlefield without just giving them a large number of stat blocks a la Pathfinder 1st edition or D&D 5th edition. So despite the rare tag, I would recommend all GMs to allow it. This doesn't seem to be a crazy broken spell or anything. It's just going to add a little more tracking burden on you, but as long as your player is on top of things, you should be fine. In fact, if your player is dissatisfied with this being rank 3, you can even downcast this to rank 1 if you want. Just start at 2 minions at rank 1 and heighten it in exactly the same way. It will hit 6 at rank 3, and it'll heighten in the exact same way after that point too. So homebrewers, feel free to take the spell and go wild with it, because Paizo is kind of giving you permission to do these things now. Then I want to talk about Earth and Sky. Now this is an epic and cinematic spell, and in my opinion, mechanically pretty good too. When you cast this spell, it creates an emanation, and you go 100 feet into the air. And anyone who doesn't critically succeed is going to go 100 feet into the air with you. And then all of you fall, but you're the only one who falls as if you had gentle landing on you. So you will come back down safely, but all of the creatures around you, as long as they didn't critically succeed, will automatically take 50 damage and fall prone. Now, of course, there's a big caveat that this is a high rank spell, and high rank creatures tend to have ways to fly. But if you notice, on a failure, it does not allow them to arrest the fall on the way down. So they will just fall and take the damage and fall prone. So this spell is crazy. It effectively reads, an enemy that cannot fly must critically succeed or take 50 damage and fall prone, and an enemy that can fly must succeed or take 50 damage and fall prone. This does not have the incapacitation trait, and really the only downside of the spell is that friendly fire is a concern because it's a 20-foot emanation that does not exclude your allies. But really, if your ally is going to use the spell, melee characters should get out of the way because this is a crazy good spell to be using. It can generate so much value for 2 actions. Again, this has the uncommon tag, so if a GM does not want you to take the spell, they don't have to. But honestly, I don't think the spell is doing anything too broken for a 6th rank spell. It's definitely up there. Like, it's probably one of the better 6th rank spells. But when you compare to powerhouses like Chain Lightning, Slow 6, Wall of Stone, it's not doing anything that is overly unfair in my opinion. It's just a really powerful and good spell. And finally, let's talk about this cool new spell catalyst, Dragon Scute. This is a catalyst that modifies the Mountain Resilience spell. Now, Mountain Resilience is a spell that's designed to give you resistance to all physical damage for 20 minutes. 20 minutes makes it a really easy spell to pre-buff with, and the only downside is that each time you take a hit, the duration goes down by a minute, but it's still going to last through most combat encounters and have given you an opportunity to pre-buff with it before. Mountain Resilience at a baseline is a good spell. This spell lets you modify the resistance that you get from it. So depending on the spell tradition of the dragon that your Dragon Scute corresponds to, you get a different resistance. Arcane gives you resistance to all spell damage. Divine gives you resistance to Spirit, Vitality, and Void. Occult 2 mental, and Primal gives you the physical resistance of the original Mountain Resilience and Poison. So this is a very handy catalyst to have if you know you're about to face something that's likely to use one of these damage types. For example, any of the 50 dragons that Paizo just gave your GMs to play with. So keep this in mind if you're ever going to be entering the lair of a dragon. There are higher level versions of Dragon Skewed at level 16 and 20 respectively. I omitted them from this slide to avoid overloading you with details. But they just correspond to higher rank versions of Mountain Resilience, and they give you higher resistances to the corresponding damage types. That being said, you're probably going to be using the 12th level version of these the most. I would also recommend that if you ever cast Mountain Resilience with or without Dragon Skewed, cast it from a Wand of Continuation, so that you can give it a duration that's 30 minutes rather than 20, and make it last through more attacks than it otherwise would have, as well as be more convenient to pre-buff with. And finally, let's talk about the thing I had honestly most hoped for as a player-facing option in this book, and the book delivered, the Drake Rider archetype. Now, the Riding Drake is an animal companion that exists in Pathfinder already, but it is unable to fly. It has the Mount special ability, but it's not allowed to fly with that ability. It has a 45-foot land speed, but it can't fly. And well, this archetype fixes that for you. There is a level 2 dedication feat that lets you take the Riding Drake as your companion. It also lets you take a Dragonette option printed in this book, as well as any other companion you may have access to that has the dragon trait. So for example, the Wyvern companion. And then there are follow-up feats for flying. So at level 4, if your companion has the Mount special ability, which the Riding Drake has, they get a limited use flight. They can move from solid ground to solid ground by flying once per round, and then at level 10, which is a standard range for these kinds of abilities, it gets upgraded to full flight. And that is honestly all this archetype needed to do for me for it to be a hit, because I just want my Riding Drake to be able to fly. It also has a few other interesting feats. This is one that stood out to me just for being cool. I don't think it's particularly powerful since it is a stance, and stances are mutually exclusive. This is a stance which you enter in which your Drake creates an aura within which it breathes on enemies if they start their turn there. The damage is not a lot. It starts at 1d4 and scales up to 2d4, and it offers a basic reflex save, but it's a nice, okay chunk of free damage, ultimately, if you've been able to enter the stance. There are a few other cool feats as well, particularly ones that are designed to keep you defensively good while you're on the Drake, but ultimately the big selling point of this archetype is that it lets your Riding Drake fly. So that will be all for today's video, folks. This video was honestly a bit of a surprise to me. I had forgotten that I asked for review copies for this book I was so excited about. That's on me. This is not interrupting my normal sequence of videos. I am still going to be releasing my normal ones on schedule. That being said, it has been overall busy, so the schedule has been roughly bi-weekly. I apologize for that, but I hope you're still enjoying the content. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to support me, please join a channel membership. It is a great way to directly support me. And of course, if you want to support Paizo, go ahead and buy this book. It is well worth your money. It is definitely my favorite Lost Omens book. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.